Okay, hi everyone. Good afternoon. A very happy Friday to all of you. I know this is the last panel of the day. CFR does so many great panels, so I don't want to say saving the best for last, but you are in for a really special treat, and it's such a real deep privilege and pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate today's panel on climate policy and implementation. Delighted to have three really fantastic speakers joining us. And before I introduce the panelists, well, I should say my name is Carolyn Cassan. I'm the Associate Dean at the NYU Center for Global Affairs, and I founded the NYU Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab. But what we had talked about is we would love to find out, because I know many of you in the room teach courses on foreign policy, international relations, issues around security. So we're curious to get a sense of who in the room right now teaches or integrates climate change into your coursework. Wow, thank you. Alice, really a fantastic number of hands went up. So we are really, really delighted to see that so many of you are teaching about and thinking about in your coursework and in your research. And again, you know, as you have found out over the course of today and last night, and hopefully all of you are using or will use CFR's resources. They really are fantastic. I have found them to be very useful for me in the classroom. So, but I know you're not here to hear me talk, you're here to learn from our fantastic panelists. So let me go ahead and introduce Selwyn Charles Hart. Selwyn is a special advisor to the Secretary General on climate action and Assistant Secretary General for the Climate Action Team at the United Nations. So Selwyn, thank you so much for joining us. Jonathan Goldberg, founder and Chief Executive Officer at Carbon Direct. Jonathan, thank you. And Alice Hill, who is joining us here virtually, is the David Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment, Council on Foreign Relations. And I think you'll also see Alice has written some really spectacular pieces in foreign affairs on climate, and some of that we'll be talking about today. So we're really lucky in terms of the three panelists that we have. We have the United Nations represented. We have the private sector looking at what is really exciting space in terms of what's happening to reduce and to both reduce and to eliminate carbon. And then, of course, Alice, in terms of her research, in terms of looking at climate change, security, resilience, a lot of work on infrastructure. So we're going to get started here first with Selwyn with the first question. So Selwyn, you were in the United Arab Emirates in November. I'm sure many of you in your classes were talking about COP28, Conference Parties number 28. Can you share with us what you took away in terms of wins that came out of COP28?
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And COP28 occurred at a pivotal moment in the global fight against the climate crisis. The Paris Agreement is 8 years old. It's the first multilateral agreement on climate, which calls for action to be taken by all countries, by all parties. The COP also occurred at a time when, so you all know that the world is bitterly divided. We have these geopolitical tensions, significant geopolitical tensions, yet close to 200 countries were able to agree on a set of outcomes that provide us with a very clear roadmap for the next 2 years. So going into the COP, the Secretary General had three major priorities. First, this was a COP to conclude the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. The global stocktake is an important element of the Paris Agreement architecture. It is a moment of collective reflection on what has been achieved and what needs to be done to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And it is to set the stage for countries to prepare their next, and I'll use an inside baseball term, their new nationally determined contributions, which are or national climate plans, which provide clarity on what each party would do to reduce emissions and build resilience. So it was absolutely important for the first global stocktake, to provide very clear guidance to parties on the ambition level and the quality of the national climate plans that they will work on over the course of the next 2 years and submit well ahead of COP30. And we got a good outcome. They agreed that the next round of nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, should be economy-wide, covering all sectors and categories, and covering all greenhouse gases. And more importantly, or equally importantly, they should be aligned with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. So very clear guidance. Now, countries over the course of the next 2 years now need to do their homework and prepare credible 1.5 aligned, high quality, nationally determined contributions that really show how they're going to significantly bend the emissions curve and provide the signals that the private sector desperately needs to scale up the investments in emission reduction technologies. The second, I would say, area of progress was on the energy transition. The famous paragraph 8, and I know that we'll get to that soon, really provided some forward-leaning elements to guide countries on their respective energy transition pathways. Call for a global tripling of renewable energy capacity, a doubling of energy efficiency, and the famous transition away from fossil fuels, which I know that we'll get to later, right? How these are integrated into the NDCs will be absolutely critical, and it will be one of the great tests and battles over the course of the next 2 years. The third priority of the Secretary General going into the COP was around climate justice. We know that impacts are worsening around the world, with the most vulnerable, the developing countries, the low-income countries, small island developing states bearing the highest burden as it relates to the climate crisis. Unfortunately, we did not see the level of progress that we would have wanted on the climate justice front. Yes, the new loss and damage fund was approved. You may recall that this has been a constant request from the vulnerable countries for over 30 years. It's finally approved with contributions totaling close to $800 million. But placing that in context, $800 million for about 130 countries, when conventional estimates on the loss and damage requirements of vulnerable developing countries is in the region of $100 billion a year. But it's a start. There was also some outcomes around adaptation, but quite frankly, on the climate justice front, we really can't chalk that up as a win. And it will be critical in the next few years for us to define more concrete and ambitious ways and objectives and goals towards addressing the worsening impacts and preparing communities, peoples, and countries to address what we are seeing and likely to see as global temperatures increase.
Thank you, Selwyn. Maybe a very quick follow-up, because you are from Barbados. Mm-hmm. You have represented Barbados in climate conferences in the past. Was there a degree of satisfaction from the small island states, which are, as you pointed out, the most vulnerable?
Well, I believe it was a mix. At the end of the COP, they were not happy. And most of you, or many of you, would have heard the intervention by the delegate from Samoa, Anne, a very good friend, who expressed some concerns that the outcomes of the COP were not the game-changing outcomes that the small islands would have liked. The reality is, despite the progress that was made, we are on a 2.4 to 2.8 Celsius degrees Celsius increase in global average temperature, right? That's the trajectory. When the Paris Agreement was finalized, we were heading towards 4 degrees Celsius. So it has made some difference, but the pace is not fast enough. We're still not on a safe pathway. We're not on that 1.5 degree pathway. We're not on a 2 degree pathway. We still have a lot of work to do. And on the adaptation and loss and damage front, it still remains the neglected half of the global climate equation. At a time when we know these impacts are worsening, and we're seeing it in this country, we're seeing it around the world. Vulnerable countries see it most. The IPCC has identified Africa, South and Central America, parts of Asia, and the small island developing states as the global hotspots for the climate crisis. And mortality from climate is multiple times that of other regions. So these countries are seeing these impacts in real time, and their needs, quite frankly, are not being met.
Thank you. It's a kind of a perfect segue to Alice, and I'm going to very strongly recommend, as an educator myself, I use this actually piece I required reading for my students in her August 2023 Foreign Affairs piece, "The Age of Climate Disaster is Here." So Alice, you present a very sobering picture of the devastation caused by climate change and the challenge to our current infrastructure. And Selwyn just went into the challenges of adaptation. So how do you think about the very sort of the massive infrastructural challenges, not just here in the United States, but worldwide? And how can governments and the private sector better cooperate to address these challenges?
Well, thank you, Carolyn, and it's really my honor to be on this panel. Selwyn has done a great job of describing some of the challenges that climate change is already revealing. Ahead, there will be more damaging impacts: droughts, wildfires, extreme precipitation, flooding. And we are on the globe heating up quickly. NOAA has just concluded that 2023 temperatures were 1.35 degrees above Celsius. That was the warmest year ever recorded, and it looks like 2024 may even beat that. So to put this in perspective, from what the scientists are telling us, a child born in 2023 may look back on that year as the warmest year she experienced. Could be, but certainly, the coolest year she experienced, and certainly will be among the coolest. And what does that mean? That means that all this infrastructure investments that humans have been making for the thousands of years when temperatures have been stable are not proving up to the challenge in an unstable climate. And that's why you're seeing massive failures. We're seeing it in less developed countries, but we're also seeing it in the developed world. The infrastructure, virtually all of our infrastructure, was built for a climate that no longer exists. And so it is vulnerable to more water, less water, wildfires. We have also huge investments along our coastlines. In the United States, 40% of the population lives in a coastal county, but that only makes up 10% of our land mass. So we have very large investments in areas that are highly vulnerable. It also affects major ecosystems that we rely on for water, fresh water, but also for transportation. Just think about the Mississippi River. That carries 90% of our agricultural exports. And that river shuts down when there's too much water, which it occurs as well as during drought, with major implications for supply chain as well as food security. So we know we're in a bad way. Last year, we had 28 separate $1 billion events causing damages of $1 billion or more. And if you look back 40 years ago, on average, we had just one of those every 4 months. Now, adjusting to 2022 dollars, we are having one every 3 weeks. Our infrastructure just isn't up for these new extremes. So as a result, I'm sure some of you experienced this in some of your states, the insurance industry is beginning to pull back in certain geographic areas, notably California with regard to wildfire, and then in our coastal Gulf states with regard to wind insurance because of big storms. In the 1960s, we saw a pullback of insurance, private insurers, for flooding. The private insurers looked around at some floods that had occurred and said, you know, we really don't like that risk. We just don't want to insure on it anymore. So Congress stepped in and created a national flood insurance program. That has not gone well. That is basically $20 billion in the red. And it can't get to a point where it charges what are called actuarially sound rates, rates that really reflect the risk, because the rates are too high. And when rates become high, people make choices not to buy insurance unless they're required to do so, which they are required if they have a federally backed mortgage. But with these Texas wildfires, there's very recent reporting that about 25% of the population that lived in the rural areas that burned had no homeowners insurance. That has profound impacts for the local economy. That makes it much harder for families to get back on their feet. They have to rely on federal or state aid or their friends and family. But if you have one geographic area that's deeply hit, those funds may be in short supply. The question you asked, Carolyn, is what can we do? Oh, there's so much we can do. But we find that there is a lot of pushback for the choices that need to be made. We need to focus on where and how we build. And that means that there's some areas that are just too dangerous to build in anymore. But we have more people, as I've said, in the coastal regions, and more added every day, even those purchasing in known floodplains. We are very confident that those floodplains will see even more floods in the future. We also need to change how we build. Our building codes are backwards. 65% of counties in the United States do not have a modern building code in place. And by the way, these modern building codes only look to historic risk. They don't look to future risk. But we have 65% of our counties that don't even do that. So folks that are building in those areas are building structures that will fail. So it's a massive overhaul of our investments. We have to de-risk some of these investments to invite private capital. But I also think there's a more fundamental challenge. And I was delighted to hear that there were so many people in the audience teaching climate change. We need a workforce that can deal with this. We do not have that workforce. We don't have it in the federal government. We don't have it in the private sector. In fact, I was surprised to learn, as far as I know, and I hope that maybe someone in the audience can correct me, there's only one school in the entire United States that requires education on climate change. That's the University of California at San Diego. So that means a young person can graduate from our fine higher education institutions and avoid learning about climate change. That leaves us very ill prepared for the scope of the challenge that is ahead. So it's all doable, but we need to get started. And that will begin with having people who understand what the challenge is and have the tools that they can find the solutions for those challenges.
Thank you, Alice. I see lots of head shaking, and I see people very much acknowledging what you said. So I am confident that those educators in the room that will be going back with even sort of more motivation to the work that you do in and out of the classroom with students. I'm going to move to Jonathan. So Jonathan, you're the founder and CEO of Carbon Direct. By the way, I really encourage you to look at the website for Carbon Direct. Really fantastic to understand thinking about carbon. And one of the things that Carbon Direct is, focused on is reduction and removal of carbon. And a question that I have for you, Jonathan, is that, by 2030, the world needs to remove 1.2 billion tons of carbon annually. And based on what you're doing at Carbon Direct, how is it that you think about going about achieving that level of reduction? And what are some of the kind of more of the innovative ways that you see you're thinking about and companies and governments are thinking about carbon removal and reduction?
Yeah, I mean, I think within both carbon reduction, where we'll help our partners, and also in the physical removal of CO2. So both dealing with the flow of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere every year, and also the residual stock of CO2. It's not just one or the other. We've already emitted over 1 trillion tons of CO2. It's sticking in the atmosphere. It's long lasting. There's ways to deal with that. We need to both address that stock and also the flow. We're working with companies and technology providers on both of these things across a different range of solutions. And I mean, I guess I'd say there's good news and there's bad news. There's a lot of technology innovation, and it's always really exciting to see whether it's in new forms of lower carbon fuels. We're working with companies that are literally taking CO2 as a feedstock and converting it into syngas and then fuel. You can actually burn fuel with no incumbent CO2, lowers contrail emissions. It's really, really positive, but they're early, right? And they're very much at maybe not the lab stage, but that early project phase. And what we have right now is this big gap, if you will, both in policy, which is sort of getting there, and also in the capital stack to take these promising technologies and get them to scale. We use 100 billion gallons a year of fuel, and it's just minuscule what's actually produced for lower carbon fuels. So the good news is we have some technologies, we have some blend mandates like in Europe, but we're really missing that middle. We're really missing that implementation factor to go from small to large. I couldn't agree more with Alice in terms of, the people skills are super important. Some that's, just physical sciences, so the work that the people in this room are doing. I'd also say it's, training or retraining. We work with a lot of sort of engineering staff that's come from oil and gas industry, because we need to take some of that same skill set and drive these other things. So there's this wide range of technologies, but are we close in sort of the physical element of delivering 1 billion tons of removal by 2030 or the equivalent amount of reduction by 2030? No, it's very, very far from.
Maybe a quick follow-up question. So, carbon capture, storage, direct air capture, those are, and those were recognized in the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, kind of very much is sort of recognized as the United States' most ambitious climate legislation. How do you see that, those two specific types of technologies playing a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think even more than in the US, and US is supporting both carbon capture and carbon removal, and these are distinct things. One is stopping CO2 from going into the atmosphere by essentially capturing from flue gas of cement or steel. You stop the CO2, you can stop about 95% or more of the CO2 from going into the atmosphere, and then store it underneath the ground. Or you can remove CO2 from the atmosphere through things like direct air capture, biomass with carbon capture. There's some other technologies, and of course, nature-based solutions using forests and soils and oceans and the like. So the US is supporting these things through tax code. That's sort of generally how we do climate policy, through something called 45Q, which pays money in the form of a federal tax credit for both capture and removal. And recently in the EU, within their industrial policy, and these are binding commitments, there's about 400 to 500 million tons of both CCS and also carbon removal embedded in the 2040 plan. These are massive, massive, massive numbers. The industry is a fraction of that. You know, we're talking 100-fold increases by 2030 and then doing that again by 2040. So all of the above are quite important. There's a variety of different tax incentives for them.
Excellent. If I could just share a quick anecdote. Over the summer, I worked with 10 high school students from 2 Brooklyn high schools that worked with Air Company. And Air Company is a...
I'm on the board of Air Company.
You're on the
so
board.
yes,
I didn't even
well.
know this. We didn't set this up. But what was great was, you know, what Air Company does is they convert carbon, and they originally started, and Jonathan, you could probably give a better picture, but they started converting carbon to alcohol. Vodka, I think, was the first, and then they moved.
It's the only cool company I've ever invested in.
And then they moved to hand sanitizer. Then they moved to hand sanitizer during COVID, and now they're doing sustainable aviation fuel. But what was really wonderful in terms of how I was working with them is that they were working with 2 high schools to bring an understanding of carbon capture, looking at it in the context of environmental and climate justice, and bringing it in at the high school level with the hopes that, you know, those students would then want to go and, you know, work in the climate change space. So anyhow, thank you so much. I'm a big fan. So I'm going to go to Selwyn, and this is kind of a perfect next question after Jonathan. One of the big things I think that came out of COP28, and there was a lot of course, attention in advance because COP28 was in the United Arab Emirates. And the chair of COP28 was Nursultan Al Jaber, who is also the president of ADNOC, which is the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. And one thing that was kind of considered a win from the COP28 was the language in the final document of a transition away from fossil fuels. So I'm kind of curious because, you know, it's also hard because we see year on year increases in the amount of fossil fuels that the world is using, whether it's natural gas, oil, or coal. So can you just sort of shed some light on, one, that was a big win to get there because it was kind of hard to believe. It was the first time that fossil fuels were directly sort of in the agreement, and sort of what your sort of take was afterwards.
Thanks. Really tough question.
Sorry.
No, but to you, it's pretty absurd that after 30 years of climate negotiations, that the culprit behind the climate crisis was acknowledged. But that is where we are, and I agree. It really was a positive step forward. But this positive step forward now needs to be translated into concrete actions, and it needs to be translated directly into the policies and regulations of countries. We're absolutely clear, and the Secretary General has said this repeatedly. The transition is inevitable, right? We've never seen renewable energy deployment at the pace and scale that we're currently seeing. Record levels of renewable energy deployment. And in most countries, renewables plus storage is cheaper than fossil fuels, right? In most advanced economies. But there are 3 really big questions that must be addressed over the course of the coming years. And first, will it be fast enough? Will this transition be fast enough? The reality is that many countries have pledged net zero by 2050, but it's this critical decade that really matters. We need to rapidly reduce emissions this decade to stand a fighting chance to meet or to achieve our long-term climate goals. The IPCC and the IEA both estimate that global emissions need to decrease by over 40% over the course of the next few years. And we're not on pace to do that. global emissions continue to increase. So we're not on pace. So the speed of the transition will be absolutely critical. And the reality is that those with the capacity and the capability will need to move first and will need to move fastest. It means countries like the US, like the G7, those countries who have the capacity and capability, they need to move first and they need to move fastest. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that leadership in some quarters. When you look at the expansion of oil and gas expansion, right? It's primarily in the global north, right? And that is a problem. That is a major problem. So the speed is the speed of the transition is the first challenge. The second is fairness. Will this transition exacerbate inequalities within and between nations? One of the outcomes at the COP was the acknowledgement that pathways towards transition need to be consistent with the development needs of countries, and there needs to be a recognition that the development imperatives of developing countries must be respected. But we also know that most of the global demand for energy is in the developing world, and most of it will be in the Asia-Pacific region. So we massively need to scale up international cooperation to ensure that this new energy demand is met from renewable energy sources. They have access to the technologies and the finance that they desperately need in order to accelerate the pace of their transition. And we also have countries who have vast resources, energy resources, but still lack access to energy. Let's take the example of Africa. 30% of the critical energy transition minerals are in Africa. 60% of the global solar capacity is in Africa. Yet it attracts a mere 2% of global clean energy investments, and 600 million Africans still lack access to basic energy services and electricity. So the fairness element of this transition must also be seriously addressed. And we know what the challenges are in these countries. Yes, they need to create direct domestic policy environment, but we also need to address some of the systemic injustices in the global economic and financial system, where perceptions of risk, where these countries, where the perception of risk negatively impacts on many of these countries. Let's take, for example, solar, right? Same investments, same technology. The cost of when one looks at debt or equity in Germany is about 2 to 4%, the cost of capital. In Nigeria, it's 19 to 20%. Even in Kenya, it's about 15%. Right? So addressing these challenges, these systemic challenges, must be priority number one. And finally, will it be funded? Will it be funded? 90% of the clean energy installations last year, the renewable energy installations last year occurred in China and the advanced economies. 90% in China and the advanced economies. The rest of the world is being left behind. And a lot of it is due, as I said earlier, to the financing issue. Absolutely key will be getting key stakeholders in the global financial architecture working better, much better together. And as you know, many of us have been championing this notion of reform of the international financial architecture, including the multilateral development banks. These institutions, they sit at the intersection between public and private finance. They have tools, they have instruments that can be deployed to help these countries accelerate the pace of the transition. I believe that the World Bank is moving in a very positive direction under new leadership. But these institutions need the support of their shareholders, the governments, primarily governments of the West, to make them bigger and bolder. And I think a bigger, bolder MDB system will be critical to ensure that the funding, that the third F is addressed.
Excellent. Well, Alice, this is a nice opportunity to have you jump in here. In terms of thinking about what, Selwyn has so eloquently, spoken about in terms of the need for better, more effective, I think more targeted climate finance. But how do you think about balancing the demands that are required to address mitigation, and as you have as you've shown us in your own work in terms of the need for really putting a lot of funds into adaptation? So how do we get that? Is there a way to balance funding for these two critical sort of parts of addressing climate change?
Well, it's an excellent question. Definitely the funding so far is very imbalanced. And that's despite the fact that the Paris Agreement 8 years ago, to which virtually all the nations agreed, states that financial resources should aim to achieve a balance between adaptation and mitigation. But adaptation, for a host of reasons, doesn't get its fair share. Among the reasons is it's very context specific. It's not as sexy, probably, as some technological solution to cutting emissions or pulling them out of the atmosphere. It requires a lot more. If we think it's tough to get mitigation agreed to, it requires really a lot more buy-in within the community. And so it takes time, and it raises, as Selwyn has said, huge issues of equity. But because we're not investing in adaptation, as I've said, we're seeing the damage side of the equation continue to mount. And we simply are way, way behind. We're certainly very behind on mitigation, but we're even further behind on adaptation. The adaptation needs estimated by the UN Environment Program say that it'll be somewhere up to 300 billion per year by 2030 and 500 billion per year by 2050. But if we continue to have the failures of existing infrastructure that we have, I think there's a risk that there's even greater damages and need. And that raises the question, in my mind, will the failure to adapt affect our willingness to invest in mitigation? There's so many demands for the money, but if people are suffering, they're homeless, they don't have enough food to eat, they're going to be on the move. There are many global and national security implications to these impacts. What will that do to the will to do what we know we need to do to cut emissions? So we are seeing a struggle here. It's played out at virtually every COP. It's been very painful to watch. The developed world has not come forward with the amount of funding, as Selwyn has said, that they promised and that they should be coming up with. So it's not a happy picture.
Right, Alice, thank you. And I think very much in terms of given our audience, in terms of thinking about the national security, the climate migration issues, the 2022 US National Security Strategy had climate change 64 times in it, right? So I think very important in terms of what we're talking about. So one more question for Jonathan, then we're going to be opening it up to all of you. So please think about the questions that you'd like to ask. So Jonathan, I mean, it's been pretty dramatic. I mean, I've been working, kind of teaching in the climate energy space for now about 20 years, and carbon has really been like a change in the way that we think about it, the idea of the business of carbon, the idea of, you know, many more companies and technologies that are out there sort of addressing the carbon problem. What do you see as where do you see the appetite in the private sector, both for the innovative startups, but also sort of the larger funds that are in positions to help sort of fund new technologies? And, you know, maybe what is a technology that you're really excited about? Like 4 or 5 questions there.
So I mean, I think in the private sector is obviously quite diverse in how it thinks through these things. One, I think that for most large corporations, they're looking probably more or less for the first time over the last 5-10 years as carbon also has a liability, right? Either a regulated liability through CSRD and other things in Europe. The SEC has some quite modest, but starting proposals for disclosure for publicly traded companies here. California a little bit more stringent than that. So companies are sort of getting it that they're going to have to at least say what their overall exposure is in one form or another. And then their actions to sort of counterbalance that have come from a variety of, you know, internal stakeholder pressure, shareholder pressure to some extent, a variety of different private market initiatives to make commitments of one form or another, and in some cases regulatory pressure. It's nowhere near as cohesive, I think, as anybody would like. It makes companies deal with all sorts of different reporting requirements, and they don't always speak to one another, but at least it's a start. So I think that's the sort of liability side, if you will. In the private sector, you know, if you look at carbon management broadly, right? So for the first time, you know, there is an economic model. So if you take carbon capture or carbon removal, nobody pays you for that CO2 through a tax credit or otherwise. There's no model for it, right? And if you look at something like, you know, our friends in Brooklyn, you know, zero carbon fuel, and this is literally CO2 single step into fuel, is far more expensive than normal petroleum fuel. Airlines have tight margins as it is. They're only purchasing that fuel if they get some type of government incentive. And then over time, the companies are able to drive down that sort of quote unquote green premium. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Companies won't make that move. So I think, you know, funds, both sort of venture and growth funds, are really looking for what are the technologies that are going to accelerate growth into that area. And then there is a lot of capital, insurance companies, sovereigns, et cetera, that are looking for later stage project development. The challenge is right now that only really works for late stage renewable and solars. And as was well pointed out, only in certain geographies, right? So these tend to be quite risk averse investors. And they're totally fine taking a sort of de-risk 3% returning asset in a stable environment. And they're good with that, right? But that only fits for a small amount of the investments needed. And it also only fits, again, to echo the previous comment, a small number of geographies. And that's really where this scale up challenge is problematic, right? And that's what we're focused on.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to open it up for questions since you're all professors. I know that you will have lots of questions. So please stand, wait for the mic, and please state your name and affiliation. We'll go right there with yes, with the second table, and then go there and there.
Mojuba Olufunke Okome. I am concerned. Oh, I teach at Brooklyn College. I teach political science. I'm concerned about the justice aspect of it. And I spent last year on sabbatical in Nigeria at a policy institute where climate change was really the agenda, figuring out what the Nigerian position should be. And, you know, Africa is producing like 3.4% of greenhouse gas emissions, I think, and has 17% of the world population, but it's suffering tremendous effects of climate change. And then, you know, when there's talk about the mitigation and all the things that need to be done, so that we move into the future successfully. The cost for those countries is also tremendous. And there are many Africans who are arguing that, look, we need to develop so that we can feed the population so people can live their lives in dignity. And the developed countries are creating most of these emissions, and they historically have been the villains. So why are we being asked to do more? And then a lot of I like the arrangements about the trade, cap and trade, but it doesn't seem to be working very well yet. So where is the justice in this? How do we move into the future together successfully? And then equity is part of the actual, experience of people.
Thank you. Great question. Selwyn, I think you want to.
Yeah, thanks. There are a number of facets to your question, and you're absolutely right? There is currently no justice or little justice in the global response to the climate crisis. And I highlighted the case of Africa. 2% of global clean energy investments facing the high cost of capital. Many countries don't have fiscal space. So this is why issues related to reform of the international financial architecture are absolutely critical. Justice needs to be at the heart of this. The response also needs to recognize that the time frame for transition for these countries will need to be longer. Right? We all have a common destination, net zero by 2050 to keep 1.5 within reach. And one of the key acts of the Secretary General to the advanced economies is you need to truly lead, and true leadership means decarbonizing your economies faster to provide some space for to meet the development needs of the developing world. But the absolute reality is that all countries must take action. And Africa is warming faster than the global average. So ultimately, it is not in the interests of African countries and other developing countries to continue in a fossil fuel-based global economy. That's the reality. And while many countries might have the resource, and I ultimately believe that the international community will need to find some way to compensate countries who have the resource to keep it in the ground. That ultimately has to happen, right? Where there is some way of compensating these countries who will need to forego use of some of these resources. But the trends are clear, and one of the very worrying trends is that some of these countries are being encouraged to exploit these resources to satisfy markets in Europe and elsewhere, locking in potentially stranded assets for many decades to come. And again, this is another example of the level of unfairness that we're seeing. So I think moving forward, there needs to be a much greater discussion of what justice means for the developing world, what justice means for Africa, what justice means for other developing countries. But we need leadership. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that leadership in some of the key places and geographies that we need to see that leadership. So I agree with everything that you said, ma'am. But quite frankly, Africa will not be able to develop in a 2-degree global average world, because it will be significantly, given that Africa is warming faster than the global average. It will face, it's already facing insurmountable challenges associated with the climate crisis.
Thank you. We have a question here, then we'll go there, and then we'll go there. Thank you.
Thank you very, oh, sorry. Thank you very much to the panelists. And my name is John DiCicco. I'm from Middle Tennessee State University. I'm looking for reasons for optimism here. And one reason for optimism, I think, is Selwyn's observation about agreement on the need for adaptations and so forth that are economy-wide and that go across all forms of greenhouse gases. So I want to ask about 2 sectors that are both essential to human survival in various ways, and ask maybe if the panelists could comment on one of those. The 2 sectors I have in mind are large-scale agribusiness, and the other sector is the military sector. These are both big emitters, and they, it strikes me as these are areas for potential dynamic strides forward, but also that will be, I think, large challenges. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Another excellent question. I think, Jonathan, do you want to do agriculture? And maybe Alice, can you take military quick? Yeah.
Sure.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot going on with agriculture broadly. I don't know that there's one magic wand. There's been a lot of talk about an overly broad word in regenerative agriculture, but the reality is there are ways to change agricultural practices through different type of crop rotations and other areas. There's also a lot of work in, fertilizer is an amazing thing. It's also very carbon intensive. And there are lower carbon ways of making ammonia and ultimately fertilizer. There's actually quite a lot of innovation going on in these areas. I'd have a sort of comparable comment as to some of the other sectors. The innovation and the technologies are quite good. The challenge is scaling it up and also doing it in a way that doesn't impose too much cost, right? So, we mentioned the EU Industrial 2040 policy. The one area where that's really not moved forward is in the agricultural sector, right? And there's a huge amount of pushback on things that either in reality or in perception would add costs to farmers. So that we need to be very, very sensitive about that. I am excited about, we do a lot of work with Deere. We do a lot of work with other companies that have big agricultural supply chains. There's good stuff going on. I would still put it in the scale area. Alice will talk about the military, but I would point out, AERCO's first customer is the Department of Defense, and DoD broadly has done a lot historically on direct procurement. They buy a lot of fuel and have the ability to do this. It's small as a percentage of overall emissions, but they've been a first customer to actually a whole bunch of our companies. I'm sure Alice has more texture.
Thank you. Alice?
Sure, I think it's an excellent point. The U.S. military is responsible for a large share of emissions. I think it's important to remember that they have a war-fighting mission and that will be paramount in their decisions about how they cut their emissions. But there is certainly among military personnel, and I've recently was on a panel with somebody from the Navy, as well as somebody from the Army, as well as somebody who was in Department of Defense in charge of installations. And all of them said there is a growing recognition that it's in the self-interest of that warfighting mission to reduce the dependence on fossil fuels. There are certainly enough deaths occurred in war zones as fossil fuel is taken to fuel vehicles and other equipment, for there to be a recognition that if we have clean energy that's on site, solar or some other form, we can reduce the deaths of our own personnel. But they were also quick to point out that if you have a 6-ton vehicle, it's probably not going to be, or 20-ton, I don't know, huge vehicle that the Army's using. It's not going to run on an EV battery at this point. So there are challenges there. They also recognize that there were challenges in having the Department of Defense incorporate climate change in its acquisition policy. And that's both sides. That's equipment and other assets that are energy efficient or using green energy, but also assets like a jet that can fly in greater heat. Those kinds of choices, everything the military will do will be affected by climate change, and there's an appreciation that this will be a major effort going forward. And they are already suffering deeply. I'm sure you may have read about Hurricane Michael. We had some F-22 fighters, over $100 million each, these jets. And military's never come clean on how many were lost, but they couldn't evacuate get those planes out all in time. And so they were left in Florida, and the base was heavily damaged. These atmospheric rivers that are occurring in the American West, one of the person from the Navy said that they suffered $60 million worth of damage to their roads on their bases, inland bases for the U.S. Navy. So this is on their radar, but just as every other institution, they are working their way through it. And they also still lack a fully trained workforce that can make these decisions from everywhere from on the ground to at the highest levels. And that is a challenge they also acknowledged.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eunice King from Vanguard University of Southern California. My question is actually directed to Selwyn. I'm excited that you're here as a UN representative. I was kind of curious about the Nord Stream gas pipeline. I feel like the explosion that happened in 2022, this is where, the 4 gas lines that transfers Russian natural gas to Germany and to the rest of Europe. That was there was an explosion, and then a whole bunch of methane was released into the air. And Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the articles say that methane is a more potent chemical. Greenhouse gas than even carbon dioxide. And I read that it's one of the most the biggest sort of man-made environmental disaster. Especially with the Swedes that say they think with their investigation, they think it was a state actor. We know what Putin thinks about it. We know who Putin thinks is the culprit. He blames the United States, our CIA. Obviously, Washington, our politically, we deny it. My question is, I guess then, is the UN investigating who may have is the culprit behind the explosion? And then if there's an investigation, why or why not? And is it fruitful or is it futile to kind of investigate if there's a culprit to try to keep that culprit accountable for this man-made disaster?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Selwyn, do you want to maybe?
I'll have to check. I don't know.
I didn't do it.
Yeah. I mean, it is under investigation. Yes. So whether or not accountability, I think will probably be hard. But anyhow, I don't want to answer. We have more questions here. We're going to go here, and then we're going to go to the back. Thank you for questions from the back.
Hi, I'm Laura Kuhl from Northeastern University, and wanted to pick up on a theme that I think, Selwyn, you were raising very diplomatically throughout your remarks, and kind of pose this to the panel of, given that we're here at the Council on Foreign Relations, I'd be really curious what your thoughts would be on what would you see as kind of the key sort of top priorities for US foreign policy in this climate space. I feel like that's kind of an elephant in the room that hasn't quite come out on the surface in this discussion yet. And I mean, I'll just sort of point to a couple of the areas where it's been mentioned. Is one, particularly in climate finance. and the lack of follow through on the 100 billion commitment, the role that the US has played in, I think, delaying or perhaps blocking progress on loss and damage over time. And yes, we now have a fund, but then we've seen since the COP failure to elect representatives for a while. So I don't know, I just think there's a lot there to unpack, and I'd be curious what you think might be the most productive areas for US foreign policy.
Really good question. I hope I don't get in trouble with my friends in the US, but
you're amongst friends. It's okay.
US leadership across the board is absolutely indispensable for accelerating the pace of the transition, for ensuring that issues of fairness are dealt with, and also for ensuring that finance flows at the pace and scale that the world desperately needs. So the simple answer is we need US leadership across the board. Leadership by example in accelerating the pace of the transition domestically with very clear policies and regulations underpinning whatever international commitments they make. The IRA was a good start. We need a lot more in terms of concrete policies. And I will say this, to my colleagues and friends in the administration. So concrete policies and regulations really to accelerate the pace of the transition. We also need them internationally to do more on climate finance. Yes, the 100 billion is one aspect, but they also control, they're the majority shareholder in most of the multilateral development banks, right? As I said earlier, the new leadership of the World Bank, the leadership of the IDB, Ilan and his team, they are taking these institutions definitely in the right direction. But we need these institutions to be much bigger, and we need them to be much bolder. Doing a lot of the work that will help to drive investments to places like Africa, both on the mitigation, but also on the adaptation side. And we need the US both domestically and as a shareholder in these institutions to also have a very strong focus on adaptation and loss and damage. If there's one criticism, and colleagues might disagree with me when they see this, they've not always been as forward-leaning as we would want them to be on the adaptation related issues. And finally, on the international cooperation front, I'll say something very controversial. And it shouldn't be controversial, we need all of the major economies to work together to solve some of the more difficult issues related to the transition, be it on critical energy transition minerals, be it on technologies like storage, be it on channeling the trillions of dollars towards clean energy and resilience building activities in the developing world. The US-China relationship on climate has delivered very concrete results. We know these countries will not agree on everything. And, I don't agree with everything that Carolyn says.
Yeah. First time I'm hearing it. Okay.
But can climate be one of those issues where these two major powers work cooperatively together on? And can businesses, can mayors and governors, academics from these two countries work together cooperatively and collaboratively to solve some of these challenges, including some of the issues related to having a trained workforce, global and national workforce, to accelerate climate action. So US leadership is absolutely indispensable. It is needed across the board in multiple areas. And we have seen that leadership over the course of the last 4 years, but we need a lot more of it, and we really need it to accelerate the pace of the transition, but also to deliver results on the adaptation and resilience building front.
Okay, thank you. And I will say something maybe, so since we don't always agree. So it's actually interesting when you look at US and China, I think we oftentimes, like, ideally we want US and China to cooperate because they're the two largest emitters. However, there is also a kind of another side that if each country really sort of commits to its pledges and moves its pledges forward, but they don't have to cooperate as long as they are reducing their emissions, and then collectively that will have significant global, benefits. That if each country, even if they're racing to in a competitive kind of a way, that can be advantageous.
I don't. I don't agree with you, but
okay.
So I don't disagree with you, but sorry. I should. But cooperation and collaboration can happen in a competitive environment, right? And I think when we've had moments of US China collaboration, it delivered the Paris Agreement. It helped to deliver the power. Absolutely. It led to major breakthroughs at every critical milestone in the climate process. So we can still have rabid competition. I love competition, but you can also really also foster a spirit of collaboration and cooperation. So,
thank you.
So we agree, right?
We agree. We have a question in the back.
It's actually not a question. I presented to this group earlier. Hey, how are you? I presented to this group earlier today on the council's efforts to build global literacy. And what I didn't tell you is that with Carolyn and Alice's help, we are actually creating a really large library of both learning and teaching resources on the fundamentals of climate change. So climate literacy is imminent and will be available before the new school year. So keep your eyes out. If you're looking for resources to fold into your curriculum, your syllabi, just give us a little more time and we will have those ready for you. But I would say that we do touch on every single topic that has been raised here today and then some. So we're very excited about this. I just didn't want you to leave without knowing about that. So
thank you, Carolina. Thanks for all the great work that you and your team are doing. Okay, yes, another question in the back right there. Thank you.
Hey, Rudy Novak, News Air Force Academy. So 2 questions. Number one is for the whole panel, I suppose. What's the status of hydrogen, the water engine? And we don't seem to be talking about it as much as all the other sustainable alternatives for fossil fuels. And the second question is, can you speak to the oil lobby in the United States, their influence with this conversation?
Thank you. Good questions. Alice, Jonathan, do you want to take one? Alice, go ahead.
Well, as I recall, there's money in the IRA for hydrogen, and I do not follow closely where that's what has been given out or what is planned to be given out. I would note, and this is separate, I sit on the board of the Environmental Defense Fund, and their scientists have done some really interesting work. They actually drove some of the work on methane, which, as has been stated, a molecule of methane up in the atmosphere causes about 80 times the heating of a carbon molecule, but it will be gone or dissipate in just a decade's time versus hundreds of years for carbon. So it has grown as a focus in our UN negotiations, the Global Methane Pledge, and EDF just put up a satellite for methane. First time an NGO had done that, to measure methane, to capture the leaks that we've heard about and document them so that put a little pressure on or substantial pressure on fossil fuel companies that are extracting oil and releasing this methane. I bring that up because those same scientists are now attempting to alert the world with some dangers of hydrogen. Apparently, hydrogen is very difficult to detect if it leaks, but it's similar to methane and nitrous oxide in that it can cause a great deal heating, as far as I understand. So it's a little more controversial than we like, but if we can do it in a way that's safe, certainly that's an alternative that the U.S. government has identified as a sound approach going forward.
Thank you, Alice. Jonathan, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, hydrogen use right now is quite low as a percentage of overall electricity or energy demand. And then a subset of that, which is what you were referring to, is sort of green hydrogen, which comes from electrolyzers, which takes water, you split H2O and you get hydrogen. That's even smaller. There is something called 45V within the IRA that supports hydrogen use. They're still working the rules out, which has sort of slowed development. And the big debate is on sort of annual electricity matching versus monthly versus attributional matching. So basically what that means is if you're running hydrogen and you're making hydrogen, but you're using, for an extreme example, coal, the LCA on that is terrible, right? You actually end up emitting more than the alternative. But if you use green energy, it's much better, but it's more complicated than that further because it has to be incremental green energy, right? So if you're taking green energy that was being used for one thing and then you shift it over to hydrogen, the additionality isn't that good. EDF does fantastic work. I don't think the hydrogen work is an example of that. Hydrogen is quite safe to manage. Leakage is extremely low. I think the problem with hydrogen is actually none of what the good scientists at EDF say, and it's much more around cost. It's expensive. So the thing that's slowing it is green hydrogen right now is 3 to 4 times the cost of fossil hydrogen, and that's holding things back. Methane, totally agree, and it's great to see the Eurostat satellite go up.
Excellent. I love the fact that we're a very healthy panel that can agree to disagree. We have time for one more question right there.
Yeah, this is for Jonathan. The things I've heard in the past about carbon capture, carbon reduction have always included a lot of skepticism, with one of the points being the concern that this could mislead the public into thinking there's a nice, easy technological fix for carbon emissions. And I've also heard concerns that in fact, carbon companies are investing in carbon reduction because it may decrease the public demand for a reduction in the use of carbon fuels. And I looked into your background and I see that you used to work as a commodities trader for Goldman Sachs, which I assume would have had some relation to the carbon industry. So I want to ask you if you could put my concerns to rest.
No, I don't think I would put them to rest. Carbon capture done badly and explained badly is not good. So if one were to say, for example, don't worry about cutting oil production, direct air capture is just going to remove all the CO2 from the atmosphere, they'd be crazy, and that'd be really negative for climate progress. I don't think that's actually what anybody says, although certainly there's advocates on all sides that you can do. I think that in all IPC scenarios, it's quite clear there's quite a significant need for carbon capture and carbon removal, and again, these are different things. I do think that there's a lot of potential use cases for carbon capture that make no sense. Coal's a good example. Coal's too much condensed CO2. It doesn't make sense anyway. There's also all sorts of other non-CO2. So it's not just carbon, right? There's all sorts of other things, including air pollution associated with those that are just bad and shouldn't be supported. I think carbon capture and carbon removal are rightfully considered part of a holistic approach to decarbonization and then net zero. So I think that those concerns are often overstated, but not completely overstated.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to extend, on behalf of the panel, our thanks to all of you for being a great audience. Many thanks to Alice, Jonathan, and Selwyn for all of your really exceptional insights. Many thanks to all the organizers from the Council on Foreign Relations who made today, last night happen. It really is. It's so fantastic to see all of you here and for all of the work that you're all doing back in your classrooms and the work that you're doing with students. I think this is really critical. I see at NYU that we just, as a university, we've changed so much in the last couple of years in terms of emphasis on climate. We're really hearing it from students. Students really have the demand. So we need to respond. Want to wish you all a great weekend. If you're staying in New York, enjoy it. It's supposed to be a sunny one. And thank you so much for your attention.